I didn't even go to my apartment. I got picked up at the airport by my sister-in-law, who lives around the Tel Aviv area, and she drove me in her personal car to get me linked up with my unit in the south. Like I had, 45 minutes with her in the car, and then I had to say goodbye to her as well. And I was picked up at a gas station and jumped on a Humvee, and that was that. Just arriving in the south, it was complete chaos down there. At that point, the fires were still burning. There were still terrorists alive and well, rampaging around.
Well, welcome. Like this is I've already put a little music and an intro warning the listener that it might get heavy, so we can just talk normally. It's just you and me on a phone call. I mean, most likely that's what it is anyway, because I'll probably fuck up and destroy the audio. I was gonna start with just a little bit of your background, where you grew up and how you ended up more recently in this relatively intense period of your life, and well, mine as well, but in a different way. So you're from the East Coast, New York, right?
Yeah, I guess it would make sense to start at the start. So I grew up in New York. Some of my grandparents emigrated here from Europe, and naturally, with that sense that the world is unreliable and chaotic. So, sort of in that mentality, and that was definitely passed on to my parents and myself as well. I grew up in a very proud to be Jewish home, not necessarily a very religious home. God wasn't really a big part of our upbringing, here and there, but not the main thing. It was more about community or shared identity, the holidays, culture, and of course, roast beef sandwiches. My family also, parts of it went to Israel, after the Second World War. So I always had cousins who were there, and my bar mitzvah was there, and we spent summers and winter vacations there. I hope that was you pouring tea or whiskey, and not you pissing while I'm trying to get sentimental
Uh,
here.
I think we leave that a mystery, but I'm having a bit of a I'm having a little bit of a drink because number one, I don't think I was dynamic enough on previous episodes, and number two, because for old time's sakes, because that's what I used to do whenever I've actually met you physically in the same room.
Heck yeah, grease the gears a little. If it
Yeah,
wasn't 1 p.m. here, then
yeah.
but,
So you grew up in a with this family connection to Israel, and but not very religious. But so at what age
yeah.
did you at what age did it become like a serious proposition that you might move to Israel?
Um, to be honest, it was something that kind of developed through the fortuity of my youth, you might say. So, I'd been going to Israel very often as a young person. My friends were taking vacations to the Bahamas, and I was always jealous of them because I was going to Israel to like plant trees. And, at some point that jealousy wore off because I actually did enjoy being there. I understood that it was like a very interesting, and chock full of history sort of place. The people were always amazing, and the food was an experience for us. And of course, my family being close with our cousins was a huge part of growing up for me. And so after high school, it's very popular for Jews in the area that I grew up in to take a year and go to Israel before starting college. And so I did that. I did that as part of a program that would dedicate some time to the history and the archaeology, as well as getting some other general college credits while I was there. And then, one thing led to another, and I decided to stay, and join the military. You might say that I grew up in a home that was focused on public service. Both my parents, my dad was a paramedic for the New York City Health Department for very many years. My grandfather was in the Navy. Some of his family were in the military. A soldier was like the ultimate form of public service that I grew up understanding. And some of my heroes from the books that I read were soldiers. And
But they were all serving in the U.S., right? So it would be American
many of
Navy and
them, yeah, yeah. Oh, my family, yes, everyone was in the U.S. military. No one was. I had cousins who had served in the Israeli military, but from my American family, no one had made that move that I did.
so it was like a gap year, and during the gap year, you figured out that I have a connection to this place and I'd like to
Yeah.
stay.
Well, it was an idea that I had much earlier than the gap year, because during those trips, I guess like when it really started was when I was on those trips to Israel, during the Second Intifada. A couple of times I came with my whole family, but when it was more dangerous, it was just me and my father. And we took trips and visited people who lived in dangerous areas under the threat of terror on a daily basis. We visited sites where there were attacks that had like recently occurred. And being in that kind of environment and, knowing that a bus could go off at any second, you look around and you see the soldiers coming off base and you get this great sense of gratitude for them. And growing up in the family that I had been and traveling to Israel and coming back in one piece, as it were, it made me have some respect for the people who were willing to give everything to afford that peace and security for the people. And so I kind of wanted to do that. It was, you can say, like a form of naive altruism.
I can more than relate. I think it's very similar for both of us. So you make the decision to stay, and then our stories converge around what, 2010 or something?
Yeah, I think it was 2011, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
You were, you were looking for a snack, and you heard me slowly open the plastic sealed beef jerky and just eyed over.
Oh my God. Yeah. To this day, if I see someone with beef jerky, I will pretend to like whatever they like. If it's like a British person who likes cars, I'll go like, yeah. That's the XR71, isn't it? Yeah.
Very useful skill. The chameleon of the beef jerky.
Yeah. So we joined the army at the same time, did we?
Yes. Yeah. We were in a place where foreigners begin their path, starting the IDF, which is called Mikve Alone. It's sort of this introductory boot camp, you can say. They were tough, actually. They were pretty tough on us. Not in terms of like the physical sense, but we were awake at like 4 a.m. And I think that's what made it hard also. It was like just to screw with us. Like we knew we weren't in the units we would ultimately serve, and it was just kind of an extra added on dose of cynicism before you get to the real thing. That's what made it challenging, I think, for me.
Although some of the people who were there together ended up being the lifelong friends, because we weren't just random people shoved into a military unit based on a list of names and numbers. We all had a similar background. So what about the language? Did you speak Hebrew growing up at any point?
So yeah, I spoke Hebrew at a very fundamental level. It wasn't advanced. I wasn't able to converse fluently until, I would say probably 3 or 4 months into the military. But I did have a very good understanding of the elementary rules of the language because I went to Hebrew school here, and I had some cousins who I grew up with. And also, being in a semi-religious home, we use the Siddur, right? Which is the Jewish prayer book, which is basically an evolving text since 2,000 years ago that the Jews who were exiled from Israel used to replace Israel, right? That's what the synagogue became. Every synagogue at a philosophical level was meant to sort of recapitulate what the temple was. That was the Hebrew, the revival of the language in the 19th and 20th century was based upon. So I had some familiarity with those rules, and I think Hebrew is actually a relatively, rule-following language. So it made it easier for me to learn than some of the people who didn't get that exposure.
Okay, yeah, I learned it from scratch. And anyway, this is mainly about you, but I think you'll arouse some things in me that I haven't thought of in a long time.
More arousals. Man, it's only 2 minutes in.
I've been aroused for months for this, Yoni, you don't know. So we're going to fast forward a lot of things, but just a couple of questions from me. Then we had our actual standard legally mandated national service period in the army. You were in the paratroopers. I was in an infantry unit, and we did a couple of years, right? So during that time, anything particularly intense or anything that shaped you as a person, or is there any, like, out of that period, how would you view that now? Because in contrast to me, like, my clock when it comes to that whole experience, it ends in late 2013, maybe up to 2015, because I visited a lot. Whereas for you stayed there, you ended up living there, made a family in Israel after the army, a beautiful family, may I say. So how do you view that first period of a couple of years in the army?
Yeah, that initial 2-year service was very, very intense. Physically and mentally challenging. There was a war at the end of it that almost developed pillars of defense that ended up not like advancing into what it could have become, what it later did become for me. But yeah, that whole period was very, very intense, but also very meaningful. I was a good soldier, I think, because of the way I grew up and because of, the relationships I had with some of the men in my life as a child. I was equipped to do a good job. I knew what it meant to be a good soldier, and I think, some of my commanders recognized that and gave me more responsibility because of that, and I became something of a leader, even though I had a funny accent for most of those 2 years. Um, I was very young, like 1920s, to take on that responsibility. Also, when I was the most fit I will ever be, we did some pretty amazing things, overcame some really difficult challenges, and, just coming home on the weekend, like, getting off the bus and going to the markets in Jerusalem and seeing the kids and playing in the street, and being able to know that my hard work was so that this can all go on. It was incredibly meaningful for me.
And seeing me, obviously, and hearing some
Yeah, of
profound
course.
philosophical
Profanities.
arguments about what's going on. Yeah,
Yes,
profane
yeah.
philosophical arguments. That's what I meant. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the
Yeah, wrong word. So just to provide some context here for those who are a bit handicapped in their history of the Middle Eastern conflict. In the winter of 2012, there was a war, but for us, both you and I included, we would call it a sort of mini war, or almost war, because in the end there was no ground invasion of Gaza, which happened a year and a half later. But I
But
remember
there
that
was
period.
planned
We
to be.
were,
Like we were
yeah,
stationed on the border, ready to go in for a couple of weeks, and we were told.
exactly, and we were there for half a year leading up to it, so we saw the whole
Mhm. The whole progression.
intensification of the fire on both
Yeah.
sides and all that. In the end, there was no ground invasion of Gaza then, even though tens of thousands of reservists were called up then too, and it all was
Hmm.
I would say a legitimate war zone, because I haven't really seen a worse one. After that though, so we had that experience, and you're gonna be welcome to come back as many times as you want, and we can go into details of
Yeah, yeah.
things from that period. But then, so were you already out of the army when the last previous larger war in Gaza in 2014 happened? Were you out and you went in as a
Yeah. So
reservist, or what?
no, so actually for 2014, I wasn't called up because I had been in that period of time after your mandatory service and prior to actually being registered for reserves. So I tried to contact some people who I had served with to see if it was feasible for me to get in, and it never really amounted to anything. Like, I was always referred to a secretary here, a secretary there, and they took down my phone number, but no one ever got back to me. And to be honest with you, when they told me it wasn't going to be simple or straightforward to do it, I didn't really pursue further. They said they're not sure if they can get me in to be with the same guys I was with. And, I do have friends who were in the same boat as me, and they really fought and actually went into Gaza, people that they hadn't served before with. And, hats off to them, but I wasn't going there.
Yeah, same here. All the people I served with, it came at the very end of their. So the proper
Hmm.
Israelis we served with didn't do 2.5 years. They had a full three
Right.
years in the
Right.
army, and they were just counting the days towards the end. Like, they had a couple of months left,
Mm.
and then they had this war and multiple injuries. A couple of guys I knew also killed, actually, but I was out. I had taken a hard right turn in my life to somewhere else. We can talk about that
Mhm.
at a different time. But so I don't think they wanted you back then, because I don't think the best reservist soldiers are made out of the people who've only just been released from, like, the roughest, most exhausting period in their life. I think they want
Yeah, it's
slightly
that, and
older
it's
guys who know what they're defending, like people maybe with a job and a place to study and things like that.
I don't think it's just that. I think that's also a part of it. I think mainly the reason they wouldn't take me back is because I didn't have an organic place to go back to. Like you said, you and I did a shorter service than the mandatory service that Israelis had done, like those who we served with, and they went in without me already. So for me to join up, I would be with some ragtag unit and not with people I've ever trained with before. And so it didn't really make sense to.
And some context there, exactly. Reservist battalions and units in Israel are actually very well drilled together, and they probably, just like you said, wouldn't want that situation. Like, they go in as organic units who meet each other a couple of times a year minimum for like a week
Hmm.
of either exercises or proper operations or whatever. So yeah,
Hmm.
you didn't fit in. So that war was kind of more like worrying about your friends and family, and just like, for me probably, even though I was kind of checked out, but but I
Who could blame you,
anyway.
man? War is
Yeah,
hell.
yeah, this isn't about me, but yeah, I we'll talk about that later. So then, in the period between the 2014 and this most recent Gaza war that you participated in. How was it? You were living in Israel. You did a science degree and
Mm-hmm.
had a job, I assume, and raised got married and had a child in Israel. Everything. Anything else happened? Did you do a lot of reserve duty in that period or no?
Yeah, so all of that is true, except I had two children. I did my science degree in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, a pretty intensive couple of years, and then started medical school in the South. And during that time, yeah, I married a wonderful woman who I met while I was there, and we had two kids. And
So
yeah, I'd done
both were born
reserve
in
duty.
Israel, yeah.
Yeah, both were born in the South of
Okay.
Israel. And I had done reserve duty every year basically for anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks a year, with the same guys as we said before, and we became more and more organic as the years went by. Some people came and went, but the core group really stuck around through it. And yeah, it was mostly training. Sometimes we would also do like border patrol and operations, but for the most part, we were out doing like mock field operations, getting used to cleaning, operating, fixing our weapons if necessary, all of the fun stuff.
But you would have never, during that period, just to give people a little bit of context of what
Mhm.
life is like in Israel normally, you wouldn't have thought for a second that something like this was coming.
Um, Actually,
Or
my wife
mainly
calls
from
me
the
a,
north. Maybe you feared like Hezbollah
yes,
and
that's
Iran
true.
on the
That
northern
is
border.
true. Yes. Okay. So my wife calls me a cynic for that reason. Like, we joke about it because I had been all along saying like, wait for the big one, wait for the big one. And you're right. I think most Israelis, even those who were sort of aware that, war is not this thing of the past, I would say, it seems, lived in some kind of a little bit of naive la la land, thinking that grand scale wars were just a thing of the past, and we won't really see that anymore. And I always said that they were dead wrong, and yeah, you're right. I was surprised by the direction it came from, but I always knew it was kind of coming. And I always treated training as if tomorrow is the day. We have this saying, it's catchphrase. It's just like in Hebrew, it's two words. You just say tomorrow is war. And
Yeah,
that was
I
like,
remember.
not everyone feels that way. Not everyone, most people who stick around and do reserves treat it as that because it's not very evolutionary beneficial to treat it otherwise. Um,
Yeah,
so
but even if you and the at least some of the more motivated and better guys around you always had this mindset that if you don't need this today, you'll need it tomorrow.
mhm.
You never thought of it as a career option. You never wanted to be a professional soldier. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it wasn't really. I did consider the career option for a time, because it was offered to me because I was good and because I excelled at the job. I liked it. I made a lot of really, really close friends and I worked well with other people. I was in very, very good shape physically and mentally. But I don't know, towards the end of my mandatory service, I started to think like, I don't want to just be in the military. The military was like a side of my personality that exists, the side that's like willing to fight and willing to do the difficult things and face the chaos. But I also wanted to pursue another passion of mine, which would turn out to be medicine because I also believe in having this other element of my personality developed, which is focused on fixing whatever I can in the world and, taking people as they are and just objectively trying to make them better. And the military and medicine are two very, very different things, but I felt if I'd stayed in the military and done the career path there, then I would have missed out on this other dimension that I like.
Okay, gotcha. But that brings up an interesting point. Like in the reserves, those who go on to study things that are very necessary, like medicine, are often made doctors in the reserves. So we're gonna continue with the chronology in a second. But if we go into just this more recent war in Gaza, why weren't you've studied enough by now that you would have been useful as a paramedic at least, if not, in some kind of medical function?
Yeah.
Why weren't you reassigned? Because like you went into this war as a paratrooper, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I went in as a combat soldier. So I was offered to be reassigned. And when some of the people who didn't know me so well in the army that I was with this time, who only knew me like kind of marginally, would come up to me like, "Why are you here? Like, don't you do the medicine thing? You should go elsewhere." And that's because they didn't really know who I was. I really enjoy the job that I had, and also to leave my team with an empty slot, being in the job that I was in, that, I'm not going to go too far into now, but it would have been, sort of like losing an important position on the soccer pitch or the baseball field, and to sort of just do that right before a massive military operation, I felt would have been not really good for the overall functionality of our team, even though it would have been safer for me. Um,
That's interesting. You feel like you would have left a gap in the force, even though for those of us just viewing the bigger picture and not having this detailed view of the situation, all we heard was that Israeli reservists were showing up after the October 7th attacks at like 120% strength in some units. Like
yeah.
people who had been given exemptions from reserve duty years ago were showing up and
Hmm.
asking for a gun and a vest to help.
Right. A lot of people who hadn't been doing regular reserves showed up, and we can understand why. I mean, like there was an attack on our soil of that proportion. I mean, it's just shocking. And everyone who's ever had any like, any experience militarily wanted to go for it. And there were enough hands on deck at that time for sure. There were probably more hands on deck than there were munitions or guns to offer. But it wasn't really about numbers all the time. Like the job that I have in my squad is kind of essential to a combat field operating unit. And if someone else were to have to learn that job, or someone who my unit didn't know personally, I think it just that person would not have done as good a job. And that's true for anyone else in my unit also. I'm not like trying to put myself on a pedestal here. If any of the guys I served with decided like, hey, I'll go be a doctor now, their specific role would have been filled by someone who I have never worked with before, and therefore I'm not familiar with their personality, and working with them on such intense conditions just more difficult.
Yeah,
So it would
no,
have
I
felt
no, I believe you. You were special. I wouldn't sell you short because I know it because I was special. We were significantly more motivated and more
yeah, than
more
most of the people
thoughtful
that we were
soldiers
around.
and
Yeah.
and we were a slightly older on average. Those I'm talking about those of
Hmm.
us who came from abroad primarily. We were slightly older and
Hmm.
calmer, cool and collected under pressure. We had used most of us had done something else in our lives. We didn't come in
Right.
straight out of high school. For example, we had immigrated to a new
Right.
country
Exactly.
on our own, learned a
Hmm.
new language, learned a new culture, made new friends, set up a life for ourselves outside of the army. We needed apartments, laundry machines, all that. So I know that you were special, and I get that why you wouldn't just want to join the medical corps and felt like you were needed. It's not bragging. I think it was the reality for a lot of people like you.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but at some point you did go abroad for medical school, right? So let's if we now zip forward to the October 7th attacks, which
Hmm.
unbelievable. I very rarely get physical symptoms of illness from being shocked over something, and I think of myself as a bit of a dirty bastard, right? And I can say things that are absolutely disgusting, but I've reviewed all the material out there, like they filmed it all. Those I don't have a word for them. Uh,
Neither do I.
and when that all happened, are you in medical school abroad or where are you?
So I'm in my last year of medical school, and I'd been trying to do residency in the United States after medical school for a couple of years. And so to do that, or to make it more possible to match with a residency program that is of good quality, then I had to do rotations in my last year in the States. So I'd done one rotation in Seattle, and then another in LA, and then I was on my third of four in New York, when this all transpired.
I mean, you have a upcoming very lucrative and interesting and rewarding career, and you have a family across the ocean. Your first instinct, I gotta get back on one of those weird government planes that are coming to get reservists from various
Not
countries around the world.
Not quite, not quite. I, like you, woke up that morning to the horrific scenes that we saw, and some of the GoPro footage that we saw a couple of days later, and was just, my world was shaken. I think the way that there was a world that existed before 9/11 and another one after, I believe that this was another turning point in history, for Jews and for the world, as we're seeing. And yeah, I was just shaken to the core. Like it really. I think for most Israelis, it shook our sense of security. And I think like, that what people don't realize is that even before October 7th, I mean, there were like, there's something like on average 3 terrorist attacks a day in Israel or attempts, even if they're small ones with knives, like, anywhere you go in the country, you don't feel safe the way you do walking around Finland or America. It just doesn't, that level of security doesn't exist anywhere you go. But to see some of that footage and to see young women being dragged by their hair, that was just something that, I
And
just,
I like to talk about things with their real names here. Like our listeners have been pre-warned that it's heavy, but like footage of people being raped to death and like I there are some things
babies
that even
having their
I
head
don't
blown
want to
off.
say here, and it's not because I
Yeah,
don't like. There are certain things that you know about and I know about that it's not worth saying out loud because I don't want to not only ruin someone's day, but I don't want to ruin someone's life because you might
yeah,
get PTSD from just hearing it.
yeah. And certainly if you can from
Yeah,
watching it also.
exactly, and we probably have that, and we're gonna get maybe today or maybe in a different chat. We're gonna get to some of the implications of what this all does to you, and you on a different
Mhm.
level because you then had to enter this war. But we're talking about just the trauma of that event for any human being who
Yeah,
chose to, and I chose to watch it all, hear it all, read it all because someone needed to be witness to it, right?
agreed, 100%. I think we all have to be witness to it now. I think what we're watching happen before our eyes now is the distortion of what actually transpired. You see some radical people debating here on TV and claiming that things that were recorded by the people who did them didn't happen. And it's quite frightening, similar to Holocaust denial. And I'm not saying that, Israel is 100% above criticism and that there weren't better ways for this war to play out from a humanitarian standpoint, but the fact that the twisting, the extent of the twisting of the truth that we're seeing means that any witness, anyone speaking about this in a reasonable and open manner is valuable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, myself, I've appeared on larger public platforms than this one, although this one's going to be massive, I'm sure. But I've been super critical about especially the period that I know about, which is when I was there, and then more broadly, I know the culture very well, I know the language, and I feel like I know the strategic bigger picture very well. I've been super critical about lots of things, but there's a difference between that and between blindly choosing a side in a
Hmm.
conflict you know very little about and then distorting your mind so much that it gets to this like hateful dehumanizing of the other
Yeah.
side. It's just weird to me, and especially since the information you're just not getting it over in the Western world from the news. Like I'll give you an example today. What the Western sources were saying about, I don't know, phase 2 of the hostage deal and what's going
Hmm.
on with it. They have no idea what they're talking about. It's coming from a filter of a journalist who doesn't really know the region that well, and they have to take translated sources in English usually, and then do a silly clickbait, summary of what people might click on, and
Hmm.
and then you compare it to just if you speak Hebrew or Arabic, listen to local radio. I mean, the deputy chief of the
Yeah.
Mossad was on the radio, leading the hostage negotiating team and giving you first-hand information of what they
Yeah.
can say publicly.
It
Like,
it
there's a bit of a
really,
huge
yeah.
difference between your
There's a huge
between
gap.
your yeah, between your slightly politically skewed Western so-called journalist who's just fighting for survival in the modern world where clicks are all that counts,
Hmm.
compared
Hmm.
to a guy who's committed his life to this and is now in the like pinnacle of his career, better or for
Without
worse. These
speaking either
guys, yeah.
language. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. No, that well, we agree on that, and I think it's just important to point out. But I mean, let's get back to you. You're not initially jumping on them on the planes that are getting the most important reservists from around the world, because there were Israeli jets landing in capital cities around the world, picking up,
Hmm.
I think, people more important than us.
Yeah. Yeah, so I made it on a flight a couple of days after. It was October 9th. I said goodbye to my whole family. I didn't know, it's also the fact that it happened in the middle of a holiday is significant too, because, I was with family that I hadn't seen in a long time, and we were spending that time together, and, I had to just pack up my things and go. Yeah, it was just crazy. And also, something I remember specifically from that day was sitting in the back of my dad's SUV with my entire family in the car, including my kid. It was just one kid at the time. And we drove through Manhattan to get to the airport, and stopped to see my sister along the way. And we made it such that we'd meet in a location where there's a military surplus store, so I could just pick up some last minute things to bring with me. And as I get out of the car in New York City, this is October 8th, mind you. Like, this is before any Israeli incursion into Gaza. And also, we already knew that it wasn't just a military operation on October 7th. We knew that they were going up to random porter potties at the music festival and putting 7.62 rounds through every one. We knew that they had burned full families alive and tossed grenades into shelters where only civilians could have been. And so I step out of this SUV into the streets of what should be like, the prime example of democracy. And I grew up in New York. I love and appreciate the diversity that we have here, and the tolerance for differing opinions. But to step out of that SUV on my way to counter a terror attack, and to hear the reverberations of the chants from the people who were out in the street parading Palestinian flags as if they had something to be proud of suddenly, and saying all kinds of grotesque and ridiculous things, was just so shocking to me. And it further motivated me to get my ass on that plane. And so yeah, I showed up. And
even before you got on the plane to take you back and join your reserve unit, you observed people supporting this attack in America.
Yeah, with my child asleep in the car.
That is fucking wild, I have to say.
Absolutely wild. Yeah, and if you don't call that radical and un-American, I don't know what is. I'm all for having a peaceful resolution between the two peoples and moving forward, and putting all the bloodshed behind us. And I agree that both sides are not above criticism. There's much to talk about on both sides. But if you're out on the streets anywhere between October 7th and the Israeli incursion, you're saying some of the crap that I've heard, it's just, yeah, you're not living on the same planet. But anyway, so yeah, I landed in Israel.
Sorry, just quickly to comment on that. I followed Israeli streets, what was being filmed and said there right after the attacks. On October 8th, there would have been very, very, very few Israelis on their streets calling for some kind of supporting some kind of awful things to happen to the other side right after. Like, that would have been the rare minority and some very extreme people, but it was never shown on public broadcasts, and it wasn't supported. No one gave them a platform.
No, they just closed a bookstore. Yeah, they just closed a bookstore in East Jerusalem. The Israeli police did something very controversial, and they shut down a bookstore in East Jerusalem for harboring extremist texts and supporting terrorism, allegedly. And every single news broadcast in Israel, except for one, which is the extreme one, is wiping the floor with the police department. Like, I can know that because I speak Hebrew, censorship, and so I can watch the public.
For distorting democracy and freedom of speech.
And that is the difference. And I'm not saying that gives us free reign to do whatever we want in Gaza. And I just, the idea that I'm not appalled by some of the things that I saw in Gaza and by the civilian loss, just because I say that the Jews have a right to live in their ancestral homeland, it's just ridiculous. It's just not a real, they're strawmanning me when they say that. I don't know if that was clear, but yeah, exactly. It's like the value systems, by and large, on both sides are very, very different. Especially, it gets complicated because when you're talking about Palestinians who live in Palestine versus Palestinians and Arabs who live in the United States, you're talking about two different groups of people, and you'll hear them say different things. I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, that most people who you meet at these rallies, Muslim or not, don't really understand what's going on, and in the conflict because they don't listen to what actual Palestinians from Ramallah are saying for the most part. And there's footage of them talking on YouTube. And if you want to understand the conflict, listen to what Israelis are saying. Listen to what Palestinians are saying. Don't listen to the bullshit you hear on CNN or ABC or any of these nonsensical, clickbait organizations. And most people aren't doing that because they don't speak the language, even though some of it is subtitle. I'm ranting. I'm sorry, but I just I have a lot to say about this thing.
The thing is, there will be hours of your rants that are, I think, worth hearing. I'll remind myself and you and the folks out there, the millions and millions of folks, and especially our angel investors in the Cayman Islands, our money guys, that this started because we had a phone call right after you got out from Gaza, and I was desperate to talk to someone who I trusted to be a level-headed, good person to tell me what's really going on there. And and so I thought once we finished that phone call that, Jesus, the world should have heard this. And so that this won't be the same conversation, but hopefully it's valuable. And so, well, we can jump to you you land in Israel after saying goodbye to your family, or now in America. And you've seen all the people protesting, supporting this stuff on the streets, and you arrive in Israel, you join your reserve unit right away. Yeah, you don't keep an apartment in Israel, right? You're not paying rent anywhere anymore or anything like that.
Oh no, so actually we had an apartment. I was in the States doing rotations at different hospitals, like we said before, but my wife had been in Israel until the holiday, so she came to the States just to be with us for the holiday, luckily. So they weren't in the South when all this happened. Had they been, who knows? I mean, that's where a lot of our friends were, and it was a holiday. Thankfully, they were just in the States with me. But I didn't even go to my apartment. I got picked up at the airport by my sister-in-law, who lives around the Tel Aviv area, and she drove me in her personal car to get me linked up with my unit in the South. I had 45 minutes with her in the car, and then I had to say goodbye to her as well. And I was picked up at a gas station and jumped on a Humvee, and that was that. Just arriving in the South, it was complete chaos down there. No, at that point, the fires were still burning. There were still terrorists alive and well.
They were still infiltrators in Israel who had done some of these massacres of civilians and stuff, who were still hiding, waiting to do more, and the whole country had to be cleared of them, and police and army, everybody was in chaos. They had also lost hundreds already, which, so tough situation. You arrive and you realize that total chaos. Even Israel, for those who don't know, we're talking about tiny places on this planet. The tiny country is potentially infiltrated to the point where you don't know what village there might be terrorists behind the corner. You're in a place where the army and the security establishment as a whole has suffered the worst embarrassment in its history, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, and in a place where, oh my God, we can talk about that as well as how the hell do you have a 60-year occupation of another people, and you've gathered rats and informants in every street corner, and you miss this. Like, this is and then there's for all of I know we have lots of hard left people who want to hear a maybe feminist angle on this conflict, which is all that stuff you immediately start hearing, which I, by the way, believed and knew immediately has some truth behind it, is that the observers, who are mainly young girls, some of them got kidnapped and worse into the tunnels of Gaza, but those observers had been warning. And the big macho culture of the big men who spend most of their military career as officers just trying to fuck these women, I think.
I'd say that's a little exaggerating, but not entirely.
No, I know. There are great officers out there. I'm saying, like...
No, but you're right.
There is a truth ring to that. It rings like a loud bell.
Yes. I will say on that, just one thought on that. People often like to focus on the warnings that there were prior to October 7th that something was going to happen, but forget that had been happening, for years also. Like, there were times where there was suspicion that some attack was imminent and it didn't transpire. And so we forget about all of that. And not to say that, it was correct of the military to belittle the warning. And obviously we were seriously caught with our pants down. And what a shame. What a damn shame that so
Yeah.
many young soldiers and civilians were just hung out to dry like that. And somebody has to be held responsible. But that being said, it's not as if uh, there was this clear picture that there was definitely going to be attack and people sat down and decided to do nothing, because you have a lot of people now who are claiming that it was an inside job, false flag, just the way Hitler did in Poland and blah blah blah. It's just not, there's just no evidence for that. And I know the IDF very well. The amount of people that would have to keep their mouths shut on the ground for there to be awareness of an attack of this scale, and for nothing to happen is so not realistic. So
No,
I
no,
don't
but
believe
I
any of
don't think
those
we need to
conspiracy
even
theories for a
address some
second.
kind of. We don't
Okay.
need to address some kind of conspiracy theories. Like
Just in case, I don't know
people
who's
are,
listening, but
they know that that's not the point. The point is that some of the blunder
Mhm.
can be cultural.
Yes, absolutely.
We grew up as guys who kind of admired the army in Israel and the whole security establishment and how quickly that fell out of me. And then on October 7th, how quickly that fell out of the whole population. And I'm just
Hmm.
saying, when we look for reasons and blame, that there is a point about culture and
Yes,
things like
absolutely.
that could explain it. And then in one night, a country that when you listen to their conversations of people who know what they're talking about, and you listen to generals, politicians, everything about bigger strategic picture, Abraham Accords, let's make peace with more and more Arab countries, let's focus on the economy, all this crap. In one night, a regional semi-superpower who thought that the problems with the Palestinians are theoretical and strategic. Actually, you arrive in a country that has become a place where survival is a victory, right? And the
Hmm.
whole mindset has changed overnight. Where
Yeah,
now
well, I would say
suddenly,
it didn't just
yeah,
change, it actually sort of regressed into what it was before the major wars, after the establishment of the state. And I think it's
yes, yes.
brought
So I was going to
Israelis
say,
back
since
to,
1973, that's the first time,
yeah.
probably, that people have thought like actually
Hmm.
just surviving and existing is a victory.
Yeah.
And it was done by guys in fucking sandals and high
Hmm.
on Captagon or whatever the
Yeah.
Assad regime is pumping into the world, was
Yeah.
pumping into the world. Rest in
Was.
peace, all the
Yeah.
Assads,
Rest in
eh?
hell. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So high on Captagon and in fucking sandals and raping and
Hmm.
pillaging and murdering. Those
Yeah.
guys caused an entire country to go from thinking they're a regional superpower to realizing that just living is a victory. And
Yeah.
that to you when you arrived must have been a shocker of a reality.
Absolutely. I mean, I got off the plane and I was in places that I had been months prior, and it was a fucking war zone. Like, I was dropped off at this gas station that I know well, and all I could think of was like, damn, we better get away from this giant store of gasoline as fast as possible. Um, and yeah, it's a thing that Israelis, I would say by and large, always knew was possible, and it wasn't completely foreign mentality or disposition because of our history and because of the constant terror attacks that do happen on a regular basis prior to October 7th. I do think the rest of the world has much difficulty imagining what that sort of thing is like, especially as I'm now living in the States. I think your average person wouldn't be able to fathom what they would need to do or how they would need to react to something like this. And,
Yeah. I mean, uh, I can imagine. So I mean, well, I can imagine because I saw and listened to all of it. But I can't imagine how you're feeling. You've left your family behind. Going. I mean, most of the country did the same, but at least their family was in the country. Maybe you felt a bit better because yours was outside. But anyway, you arrive.
yeah.
You join your reserve unit, and you know that. I mean, the reality is there's hundreds of Israelis who've been kidnapped, who are alive and been kidnapped into the tunnel system under Gaza. Under the Gaza Strip, Hamas has a tunnel system that some people say is like twice the size of the New York City subway. So you know there's gonna be some war now, and you know
Yeah.
that most likely there will be that it'll involve you, even though you're a 30-something-year-old reservist, that there's just no way that you're not going in, and everyone's going, and there's probably going to be some horrendous tunnel warfare, urban fighting, just the worst things. Nobody wants to do this, right?
Well, so actually there's more to it than that also because, we knew that a war was mobilizing, but we also felt that it wasn't going to be another operation in Gaza the way you saw in 2014. It actually looked like it was going to become a regional war because another thing that happened before any Israeli incursion into Gaza was missiles were being launched from the north in numbers that were higher than they had been previously, even though those were also a regular occurrence, part of the weather. And that's another thing I like to say to people who are like, oh, why is the IDF managing Hezbollah? Hezbollah would stop their rocket fire if Israel would just leave the poor Palestinians in Gaza alone. And it's just not true that front of the war in the north was ignited by an incursion into Gaza. Just one more point there. And so we, when I first land at that point, we're thinking, I don't know if I'm going into the tunnels of Gaza or if we're going to go, parachute into Tehran. I had no idea where, it opened up a Pandora's box, and we just had no idea where it was going. We started with the mission of minimizing the damage in the south and making sure that it was safe for people to come back to, but where it was going, no one had a clue. We thought probably the north, probably Iran, like who knows? And that was very scary. That's when it felt really existential, where, this could go to very extreme places.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was so lucky that these terrorists didn't know how to coordinate enough to do this at the same time. Israel's such a small country that if Hezbollah had joined the surprise attack from the north with Iranian support, with the support of the Yemenis and the Houthis, the only thing that would have saved Israel would have been a world war, meaning the Western world would have joined the US, the UK, everybody.
Yeah.
So that
just one correction there. Hamas was also funded by Iran. It's a different trail, a different Silk Road, you might say, but it's all from the same place.
Yes, and I think a separate episode, because I know you know what you're talking about, and I like to think I know what I'm talking about, but also I believe the only commentators on the Middle East that I respect are humble ones who understand that it's a crazy mosaic, that the more you learn, the more you understand how much you will never know, how much is unknowable. And I would just say we can do a separate one on all this general discussion on the Middle East, but we gotta get to the sex. People want the sex. And
you gotta give the people what they want.
Yeah, eventually the call comes in. It's taken it was a couple of weeks actually, which is quite a long time for Israel to wait and weigh its options of when this incursion is going to happen and how and why, and negotiations and all this was probably debated on the highest levels. But then the ground invasion starts. You're going in with a reservist unit is everyone a former paratrooper? Is everyone around, in their early mid-30s or whatever?
Yeah, so we're all paratroopers, but some people were new to the unit because they were just starting out in reserves. Actually, two of the guys in our squad I'd never really met before, and they were younger. They were like 25 or something. But most of the guys were, I'd say our average age was probably something like 30. And the majority of people were people I had known before. Sorry. I actually really have to pee. Daddy, sorry about that. I think I had a little bit too much coffee,
I heard
maybe.
Everything, but you didn't hear me.
No, I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
I was saying say hi to your family. I know their names, but I'm not going to put it out here into whatever Chinese hackers can get into this data, So
yes, those names would be much appreciative of a visit of yours sometime soon. So we'll arrange for that too.
Oh, awesome.
But yeah.
And so
Go ahead.
So we're in our reserve units of sort of various ages, all kind of with the same army background from back in the day. Some young, some older. So they finally start the ground incursion in the Gaza on whatever it was, October 20 or 22, whenever it was, a bit later. Yeah. So what part of the Gaza Strip do you go into?
So in the first weeks after the war, we were going into the kibbutzim around, making sure they were safe. We saw some of the damage firsthand, just absolutely obliterated. Everything was burnt out, just cars and bodies in places. But then after that, once we understood that we had control on the kibbutzim in the south, actually my unit went to the north because, like I said before, we were still pretty convinced that there was going to be a multi-front war off the bat, because there were rockets and drones coming over, every day in large numbers. So I actually spent the first weeks of the war in the north, kind of being prepared to go into Lebanon while also securing the border, and the different towns and cities around there. And also, whenever there was any kind of downtime, we were spending all of that time going over exercises, thinking about how we can be better, sewing up our vests so that they were just the right size and the most efficient possible. So I didn't really go into Gaza until about a month into the war, a little more even. And the whole time we're wondering, because we're being told, first of all, rumors, obviously, in the military in wartime spread like wildfire. It's just the best environment for a rumor to float. And so we're convinced that we're going here one night, there the next night. It's just never really clear, and we're getting mixed messages from our commanders and superiors. And so it's kind of this really like a mental challenge. And it actually reminded me of the war that was a quasi-war that we mentioned earlier, of being in limbo and not knowing when or if you're going to go in. And so I thought maybe I'm actually not going to go to war, even in this case, when things really seem so certain that things are advancing. And sure enough, I did.
So we went. One of our mutual friends was saying exactly the same thing, that that for the first couple of weeks it all felt very similar to what we had all experienced together, well, separately, but at the same time, back in 2012.
So we go down to the south after that time of being in the north, and then it's clear, like, okay, we're going. They're handing out the material, intelligence material, and there's like a clear plan. And so we were set to go in at like 2 a.m. on a Friday night. Actually, wait, that was the second time. So the first time we were set to go in the middle of the night on a weeknight. And we're sitting on this coach bus by the border, and everyone just passes out like from exhaustion. And then we wake up and the sun is shining, the birds are chirping. And we're like, hey, what the hell happened? Like, we were supposed to go in last night, and they're like, yeah, delay, logistical shit. We're going to go in now though. And it was like broad daylight. And it was starting to get pretty warm, actually, because October, November, December can still be pretty hot. And so we just, pack up our stuff, get in formation, and we're walking over the border and into Khan Yunis, in broad fucking daylight. And my job puts me at the front of the stack. Like, I'm with a small group of men who stand at the front of the company. And there's like a few hundred people behind us, but we're going facing all these fucking windows, any one of them. Yeah. And the idea that
would say you're walking point.
Yes, we were walking point, and I was sure as shit that I was going to get smoked off the bat. It was a very humbling moment of my life.
That's
and
such
I'll
a
never
gentle
forget
way
that
of putting
feeling.
it, Yoni. I'm sure all the people who don't have the military sense of humor will appreciate that. You were sure you'd just be blasted off the planet immediately.
Yeah. And that also it frustrated me, because it was like, when there's a war going on, there's a war between you and your enemy, but there's also a war between you and your own military, where I was just super angry. Like, why would they send us in the middle of the day? Why they don't care about us. We're just pawns. And it really frustrated me. And I'll just never forget that feeling. And we were told that there were all kinds of reasons why. But the one thing that I want to
strategic considerations that you'll never understand is what they say, right?
probably below
in the daytime, a sniper will pick you off easy, but then again, anyone trying to place an explosive in your way on the road to stop your vehicles will be seen and shot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so actually that initial incursion we were on foot. But either way, like yeah, so I don't know the exact reason, but I want to make one point with that because there were a ton of buildings, you know, not far in, about a kilometer from where we were going. So we were in perfect sniper range. You know, we were going in with the support of armor and tanks, and you know, there were known tunnels in the area of all those buildings, and we could have just obliterated them. So you could see all these windows, and like I was just so angry that that was the circumstance, you know, that they had waited and the sun came up, and you know, we knew that there were tunnels in that area, that we were briefed on them. Um, and we also knew that there potentially were still civilians in those areas. And you know what? We didn't just unload on those buildings, which would have been the safest option probably. You know, we didn't even the tanks didn't even fire shells. We just left them there, and we used some smoke grenades and you know minimalist things to sort of get out of the range of those buildings. And so this idea that the IDF was just going in and blindly shooting, and the way they try to paint the picture, they try to make it, you know, they parallel it to Babi Yar, and it's so far removed from what the actual experience on the ground was. Like, I, as a father of two, well, again, one at the time, was expected to take extra risk on my life to mitigate the risk of harming somebody else's child and keeping them from their children potentially. And I, you know, not just on that first day, but also throughout my you know, pleasant and romantic stay in Gaza, I acted with restraint, and so did the men who I was with, um, to
Yeah, well,
preserve.
that's how it is when only one side of a conflict is expected to play by some kind
Yeah,
of rules. I
yeah,
mean,
and
the
it's
guys who came back from Afghanistan and Iraq, some of which, by the way, we got to know while we were serving in Israel
mhm,
because they
yeah,
trained a lot with us and stuff. But they were saying the same, that it's fucked up that the enemy doesn't play with any kind of rules, but if we break the
nope,
rules once, they will make us a national celebrity, and not in a good way. They will put our
yeah,
trial on national TV in America and ruin our lives, you know.
yeah, yeah, and that kind of shit is just not happening in the Gaza Strip. So. Yeah, that's I just wanted to make that point while we were talking a little bit about that vulnerability. So,
But those buildings you said that you left alone, would it have been the case that since you are a reservist unit, would it have been that some kind of professional special forces had already been through there, like part of the first
no,
units that went in? Or
so
were they
no, we were
untouched?
no, they were untouched by and large. There was some action there earlier on, but it wasn't swept by special forces or by you know there we had drones going over looking around. We knew it was there. We were briefed on it, but there was no incursion into that area yet directly. And so it was still hostile. It was potentially a disaster. Um, and it, you know, luckily it wasn't, but yeah.
So, so tell me, Yoni, how did it all
Mhm.
make you feel?
Honestly,
I'm
like
kidding.
a grunt, like a grunt, like
Yeah,
an expendable grunt.
yeah.
And that's, yeah, you know, you're used to that in the military. You know, you remember the feeling. That's what your job is as an infantryman. You're a pawn. That's your job. That's how you play the game, and you're
Yeah.
used to that feeling. But it doesn't get any more pleasant. You just acclimate, and you know how
Well,
to
yeah,
operate.
we by the way, yeah, we have an upcoming episode actually, a chat
Hmm.
with another person from very different generation who I know, who
Hmm.
served in the British paratroopers, and he served in some like wars that nobody ever even thinks about that they existed, like Wikipedia pages you haven't even visited, and he remembers some instances where they were used as just by as bait by their government. Like,
Yeah.
we are gonna take an infantry or paratroop or airborne unit and just put them here to draw fire.
Yeah.
Like we always have this like semi-racist view of, like, I don't know, in Vietnam they used to say that Asians value life less than we do, or whatever. And the life of their own soldiers or babies or whatever. And actually, our governments don't value, like, especially infantry soldiers. They we
I
don't
would,
value their
I
lives.
mean, with the
Yeah.
parallel, like, you know, compared to Hamas, the IDF highly values its soldiers' lives.
Mm.
That's an easy one. I mean, that's an ideological issue, though. That's not like a political or military issue. I think that's the nature of fighting with anyone who is of the like the ideology of jihad. Like that's automatically going to make the playing field not even, because death is this great reward for jihad, like people who hold those beliefs. I mean, we saw that play out with how Hamas clearly in the early and later days of the war preferred to maximize their own civilian casualty number. I mean, there's, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the numbers, look at some of the strategies they implemented. Why weren't any of the civilians in the tunnels? Why were no Gazan civilians allowed? Like, some of those were bomb-proof. Like what, So there's no way to even the playing field, even if we had wanted to. But that being said, I 100% agree. Like our militaries don't necessarily value the lives of grunts like me and you to the extent that they should sometimes. And I imagine that's a universal soldier, or your chap from the SAS or wherever he is. That's something that we could definitely relate on.
Yeah, and I mean, these are heavy subjects. I'm thinking there'll be a nice structure here. Just for, by the way, I'm assuming anyone who started listening to this episode is still just stopped everything in their life to hear the end of this. But I'm saying I'm thinking a nice structure would be we'll go one episode on this, and then we'll do like a general Middle Eastern, what you think about with the lens of your personal experience of the
Okay.
most recent war and everything. And then we can do like a third one, which is more on the mental side, because I'm super interested. Like my life got turned around. I lost myself out there, and I didn't
Hmm.
admit that to anyone for 10 years, whether
Hmm.
publicly or privately, and just moved on to the next adventure or whatever. and
Hmm.
and not and not due to any kind of, like, you might experience this heightened trauma response of like a loud bang on the streets makes you jump or something. I
Yeah.
never had that. I was like you, cool, calm, and collected even afterwards. Never
Hmm.
had that like stress response that some people get, what you would call PTSD, I guess. But mine
Hmm.
was more of like I lost who I was out there. I have no idea what the fuck I was doing there towards the end. And
Hmm.
I'm just saying we should do an episode on that as well as a third chat. But now, just to get back to you go past the first houses. You're in the Gaza Strip. Uh, to provide some context, so Gaza Strip is a tiny geographical area populated by 2.2 between 2.2 and 2.5 million people, and nobody knows
Hmm.
exactly. Hamas isn't exactly the greatest record keeper of their population, but
They've met
um,
that obvious.
yeah, and and by the way, only numbers are only good if they sell some kind of narrative. But anyway, so Gaza City is up north, Khan Yunis in the middle, which is where you guys are going into, and then you have Rafah in the south. This war was, some would consider, strategic or tactically a strange choice that Israel went north and middle first. Maybe it had to do with that they thought most of the hostages might be down south, by the Egyptian border or something. But it was strange because Hamas's lifeline is the Egyptian-Israeli border, with all the tunnels and the smuggling and the money from Iran, Qatar, wherever it comes from. But
Right.
you are going down the middle, and
Yeah.
you've now passed the first hostile houses, or houses that could be hostile. You don't touch them. So where does this long march of fear end? Where do you set up camp? What happens?
We walk down a main road, get to an encampment that was made by armor that went with us. They sort of pushed a bunch of sand aside. Khan Yunis is like in its outskirts, very agricultural, or it was. And so the soil was just kind of moved aside to create this kind of large trench. And we spent a night in that basically trench, with lookouts at different points. We were warned that a night or two previously, there was a similar encampment, which a Hamas operative successfully opened a tunnel into. So they were like digging tunnels as we were still moving. It wasn't like these things were fixed structures. And we were told to like really be on the lookout, even within that trench. And we were told about different suspicious movements that we were seeing in the areas surrounding the trench. Um, and we spent one night in that area and actually were withdrawn after just one night. And we were never told why. We were just taken out, um, basically from a sleepless night. I think it's the strategy to like kind of expose soldiers to the combat like mentality and to the dangers of a combat zone. And then they took us out, and then you have this moment to be like, okay, that's what it is. And then the very next day after that, we were back in, um, this time on APCs, armored personnel carriers, and driven back into a more urban area of Khan Yunis, like so not the city outskirts, but more into the actual, structured urban setting. And so uh, we get out there, we're sleeping outside. It's freezing cold. It was cold because we were told it was going to rain, so we wore our rain shells and worked up a good sweat getting on and off those trucks and getting all of our gear set up. And then like the night wind chill just kind of crushed us because once you're wet, that's it. And the next several weeks that we were there, we basically spent working from that trench and then deeper into the urban, the buildings and houses, and some of like the hothouses and agriculture areas that there were. Um, when the very first day, we started to move out from our initial starting point, and we're going into homes, uh, and you see, like, I didn't see any civilians when we were first there. There was no one, no one. That's just not the enemy we were fighting. They hide in the tunnels, and they don't like make themselves apparent, and just kind of pop out. So you're like walking into this kind of ghost town. And the area that I was in particular had zero civilians present. There were just leaflets all over the floor in Arabic, that said, like, leave within a certain amount of time because the IDF is coming into this area. And so by the time we get there, there's just no one there, and we're clearing out buildings that are empty. Although you obviously operate as if you're being watched the entire time, and as if around every corner there could be a barrel waiting for you. Um, we found a lot of military paraphernalia and weapons and ammunition, both in civilian structures like homes, like private civilian structures and public civilian structures. We saw an entire hothouse. Like I'm not blanking on the word in English, but it's like a, you know, like a field crop. It just, it was controlled demolition because there were a bunch of explosives found in that area, and the engineering unit that we were paired with, yeah, were set off. And so, for the most part, during that first week, we didn't really have a whole lot of engagements. It was just, going to a different set of buildings every day, working very methodically and very slowly through them, making sure that they weren't, um, you know, being used by Hamas, and then moving on to the next one the day following.
So in the
Um,
first week,
yeah.
in the Gaza Strip, any contact with the enemy at all? Anything from the air, indirect fire, nothing?
So contact from the air, we were, told, okay, like there's something suspicious in the sky right now. Everyone take cover and look up. And occasionally we'd see a drone, shoot it down. Sometimes it turned out to be a friendly drone. Often it wasn't. But you don't take risks. Like we were even instructed, if you're told that there's a drone in the sky that's unidentified, you shoot it down and then ask questions later. So a couple of times we eliminated our own drones, and a couple of times we eliminated Hamas drones. We also had mortars that landed not far from us. The unit next to us was engaged in a nighttime operation, and someone was killed, and I think a couple other people were injured. But yeah, by and large, that first week, not a whole lot of enemy contact at all. Just kind of finding traces of them and finding equipment and clearing it out.
When you're shooting at these drones, I mean, clearly it was impossible to distinguish between friendly and non-friendly. Was it possible to distinguish between a drone that might have been carrying something that can be dropped or just a suicide drone that's coming at you to explode versus just an empty drone that like an observer drone?
Occasionally. So it's all in the behavior. I one of my jobs in my unit is to have the night vision goggles. Uh, you could tell mainly by the movement of the drone if it's gonna if once we pick up a signal that there's a drone incoming from a certain distance, if it's really picking up speed, then you know that that's probably something that needs to be taken out immediately. If it's something that's, kind of just hovering in the outskirts, they're probably just watching you. But you're never really sure. You never really know. I mean, it's the fog of war.
So hey, so far, what are you eating? What kind of food? Is it
Uh,
just combat
Pretty
rations
much
or
garbage. Yeah. Yeah, pretty much
they didn't
crap.
bring you any of them like fancy catered meals? Because sometimes when I was out there, sometimes to the most dangerous places where I thought, what the fuck are you doing here? Some kind of
Yeah.
donation van or some kind of
Mm,
civilians who wanted to give you hot food. They just showed up as like,
yeah.
yeah, like
Once we were in the strip, we stopped seeing some of that. We had gotten a lot of like hot food from civilians in the days before we were activated. But once you're in the strip, we were just having tuna cans, stale bread, and occasionally a vegetable here and there. Once in a while, we would get a care package from civilians, but it was never like actual hot food. It was the snacks and maybe some socks and that sort of stuff. But yeah, actually, the from a food perspective, I mean, I try to keep a healthy diet as a civilian. It was just not possible there.
so. Initially, it's this sort of fearful, stressful existence where
Yeah.
every house could blow up from a booby trap or anything, and a sniper, or there are tunnels everywhere. And the bad guys, they shoot and scoot. They wear civilian
Hmm.
clothes, right? No black
Yeah.
pajamas.
No, no one's
They,
wearing a uniform. Yeah, it's all
yeah,
civilian clothes.
and they could come out of anywhere. So when do they come out? When's the first contact?
The first contact is a little over a week in. Um, so, as we advance through these buildings that are cleared, uh, we set up shop in a different building kind of every night or every other night. Um, and at some point, we are at the front, it's like getting late in the afternoon. We're about to stop moving for the rest of the day, and somebody spots some activity in a building just opposite us. And everyone just hunkers down, has eyes on the building. Um, and, you know, we're just kind of waiting. And the guy who spotted the movement, he's a guy I trust. He is a man of few words. But when he has something to say, you know to rely on. He's one of those guys that only talks when he has something to say, and he knows. So I trusted it, but unfortunately, our command was skeptical. They were like, "Oh, maybe you saw a reflection of the starlight on the window pane. Are you sure it was movement? All right, let's just hunker down here for the night and keep eyes on it." Um, and so I that was a sleepless night. I mean, most nights in Gaza were pretty sleepless, but this one was exceptionally because our squad was in the house that was like basically 30 meters off of this one where we have confirmed movement in. And
They could have anything, right? The Iranians have made sure that they have some serious toys.
yeah, they could have
Those
anything, and they
fucks.
were close. If they were in there, they were really, really close. And so we keep eyes on that building. And I'm, like my immediate commander, not the person who made the decision to just lay back and watch the building. I was arguing with him. I'm like, listen, man, we got to do something. We can't just sit here all night. If there was movement in there, they know that we're here, and they're definitely planning something. Like we got to go on a night raid or something. We're not just hunkering down here. It can't be, right? And he was, mumbling because he's kind of caught between the needs of his soldiers and the needs of his or the demands of his superiors. And so, I had him kind of go back on the radio and demand that we be given permission to go out on a little night flank. Originally, our demand was to have like the armor involved, maybe put a shell in the building, because at that point we'd called out. It was clear that it wasn't civilians in there. Like, of course, it could have been. There wasn't. I'm not saying that like we were sure 100% that it was Hamas, but it would have been very unlikely because we were just sitting there. The pamphlets were all over the floor. We gave them opportunity to identify
remind
themselves.
everyone. Yeah, just to remind everyone that this is a situation where more than probably any other time in the history of any kind of warfare, the civilians have been given ample warning to get out, and that basically anywhere you're here is dangerous, and that the invading military force has been expected to, at the same time, by the whole world, to supply all kinds of aid that aren't actually, if you know international law at all, in any way required for you to supply to your enemy. When you throw in aid into Gaza, all you're doing is it goes directly to Hamas, and that's the only claim for power they have in the strip, is that they control the food, power, fuel, electricity,
everything,
all the supply.
Cigarettes. They were selling cigarettes to civilians for $20 a box. $20 in Gaza goes a very long way.
And probably diapers, nappies, whatever you call them. Basically, that black market trade of aid is how the enemy that you're fighting, the only lifeline they have, and the whole world is expecting you to provide it. That's never happened before, and it's only Israel who has been ever demanded or asked or expected to do so, and that to me was always weird, which I don't think it can ever be won that way. You win something they can't do that. But either way, I mean, we will address also, the suffering on the other side. I think Israeli media from the very get-go was very incredible reporting and level-headedness when the atrocities were happening on the Israeli side of the fence, and the beginning of the war. Like, even the extreme right-wing channel was mainly talking about national unity and civic action and that kind of shit, and I was so impressed. But when the war started, I mean, they did mention all the points we've mentioned so far, but it would be fair, maybe because we don't have a third person in the room, to mention that at the same time, by this point, hundreds of thousands of people have been told to go and live in tents somewhere in the Middle Eastern winter, which isn't like the Canadian winter, but it's still pretty muddy and cold. My point here was only that the only supplies they have to keep their life going at some kind of decent rate is supplied by number one supplier, probably Israel, number two supplier, the US and other Western countries. And when it enters the strip, it goes directly to the enemy and benefits them.
Pretty much.
So this is a fucked up situation.
Right, and then they use that aid to leverage it over the people who they were, there's evidence of them trying to keep civilian populations in areas where the IDF was already warning that they were coming. At gunpoint
anyone
in some cases,
caught somehow, anyone caught somehow impeding Hamas's efforts in this war, let's call them efforts, have been seen shot and tortured to death and stuff
you don't have
like
to
that.
wait.
We know
You don't have to wait until this war to know that. There's plenty of footage online and plenty of footage on YouTube specifically of evidence of how Hamas ruled over Gaza before October 7th. I would implore anyone who's unsure about, the integrity of the organization and whether or not October 7th was truly, in fact, a resistance operation to just investigate how they ruled prior to October 7th. And immediately that there was, it's just the Wild West out there, and they do whatever they want. They, they're
and it's fucking weird that the people saying that are the same people who in our societies out here in the Western world who care about things like not being racist, not being colonial, not
Yeah.
subjecting others to things you
Yeah.
don't want to be subjected to, and respecting the rights of minorities and women and all that. And it's so strange that in that same community, they don't understand that there's exactly one place in the Middle East that gives a shit about any of that. And,
Yeah.
and what I'm saying this now on this platform, but I should have made that more clear when I've appeared on other public platforms, because my sense of whatever Israeliness and Middle Easternness I have always goes to the critical side, because that's what I focus on. Whereas I don't realize that actually people need to understand that this is, if you care about your values, most of Israeli society, let me just put this out there as an established fact. The vast majority of Israeli society shares the vast majority of those values with you. And in the Middle East, anywhere to from Morocco to India, which
Hmm.
is, half the planet, there's probably one place that is like a tiny strip of looks like the strips that you use in your bedroom, that size place on the map that has any kind of care for any of this shit that you're talking about. And it's so strange that it's the extreme left
Yeah. That's the thing
that
is
out of
no
all the
concept.
people,
Yeah.
yeah,
There is no concept of freedom of speech. There is no concept of freedom of religion. Um, it's just not a thing there. So, you know, it, the idea that that's what Hamas is trying to do by waging a war with the IDF is so ridiculous.
yeah. Everything you just said, by the way, I didn't hear you there for a second, but it's all been recorded, so don't worry about it.
Oh,
So I will
okay. All
react
right.
to something else.
So go back and
I
listen to
think
it. Actually,
no,
my
I
my
think it's
son
because
just
my
arrived
headphone,
here, so
yeah, my headphone ran out of power. We'll
okay.
go here and we will have another chit chat hopefully soon. We can
Sounds
make it
good.
more controlled with a solid 45-minute window or something. I know you're a busy man, you're studying medicine and all that. I just want to say thank you so much for taking this time, an hour and a half of your time
It's my
to
pleasure. Thanks for,
to go through what isn't even half of what this is gonna be. We haven't even got into the really intense stuff, and we'll leave everyone on the cliffhanger of what happens with those guys in that building that we all forgot about
yeah.
already. And 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 then we'll get to the rest of the war and the war in the north with the Hezbollah, everything, and
And the men
you know
after the war.
yeah, and give me a final public service announcement, which is how we end all the episodes here. A couple of sentences people should keep in mind.
Um, just I don't know, be good to your neighbors, and let's hope that the world is heading to an era that doesn't look more like the Dark Ages. I grew up in the '90s in New York, and the diversity here. I think the only other place I've been in the world that matches the diversity would be like the south of Israel. Like, people with 7 different languages in a room at one time, and just people getting along. The that's the main difference between human beings and animals, is that we can make relationships with people who look and feel differently than we are. And let's hope we're going to continue to live in a world like that, and not like the one that Hamas wants us to live in. So yeah, I think that's like the main thing that I've taken apart from this war after much reflection. I'm sorry if I bounced around during this conversation. I feel like, some of my ideas are a little bit underdeveloped because I haven't really discussed them too much. It's another thing my wife laughs at me for. She says that I don't talk about myself too much and I'm not good at it. So I'll be working on that, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope other people were interested to hear. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
You've done an amazing job, and we will have hopefully another chat as soon as possible when you find time. And normally I'd end with my own public service announcement, but I think you've said it all, and we will say amen to that. You know,
Amen to that.
and
All right,
and
friend.
super
Good to hear
thanks to
from
you,
you.
Yoni.
Come visit. My pleasure,
All
man.
right,
My
bye,
pleasure.
buddy.